Welcome to NovaraFM. My name is Richard Haynes. France, like the UK, has just had a parliamentary election. But unlike the UK, no one's exactly won. In the second round of elections, the left emerged as the biggest bloc in the parliament, so hooray for that. And the far right was relegated to third, having looked scarily close to a majority in the first round, so also hooray for that. But because no one has a majority, now begins a period of intense wrangling in the halls of power. Meanwhile, street movements of both the left and the right are escalating. Neo-Nazi firebombings of black-owned bakeries, union protests, wildcat strikes, insurgent youth movements, and an immigrant worker movement are all gathering. But are these events simply the surface of something deeper? In this episode, Olly Haynes, a freelance journalist and co-host of a podcast about the French elections called FLEP24, took me on a journey from the breaking front-page news of the last week of drama right into the deep structural crisis engulfing the French state. So welcome, Olly Haynes, to NovaraFM.
Thank you for having me.
For those who have been transfixed by our own election spectacle in the UK, they may not have noticed that there has been an election in France as well at the same time. There didn't need to be, in much the same way as Rishi Sunak did not need to call the general election in the UK. So Emmanuel Macron dissolved the lower assembly, or the lower house of the two-part French parliament, and called early elections. Why? Because it's gone very badly for him. So why would he do that? What did he think he could gain from doing this, and why now?
There are two theories as to why he did this. The first is what you might call the Pedro Sanchez theory, which is that in the European parliamentary elections, Macron did not do very well. Valérie Hayer, the leader of his list, scored 14%, which was the same as the score of the Parti Socialiste, who in the presidential election scored 2%, and was 15% behind the score of Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National, who got 30 or 31%.
And that's the far right in France. So
yes.
the sort of centre-left in France, which are called the Parti Socialiste, they're socialists by name, but not really socialist in what we understand, did very badly. And then Macron's candidate also extremely badly. And then the far right did really quite remarkably well.
Yeah. And crucially, the more radical left did in the European elections, because they don't do very well in the European elections, did even worse than them. This theory states that Macron, channeling Pedro Sanchez, who, when he did badly in a set of regional elections, called a snap election in order to regain the upper hand and consolidate his majority, Macron thought he could do the same, could throw the forces to his left into disarray, throw the forces to his right, who have just gained the upper hand, into disarray by using the element of surprise, and come out on top, if not with a majority, then with a sort of consolidated sense of authority.
And Pedro Sanchez is the president of Spain.
Yes, centre-left president of Spain, who called the election when Sumar to his left weren't doing brilliantly, and the Partido Popular and Vox to his right had just done very well in regional elections. There's one theory that states that Macron tried to do that. If that was the case, he completely failed. The other theory is what you might call the inoculation theory. So Macron has repeatedly talked about how the far right is a fever in the French body politic, and there has been a lot of speculation that this election was him attempting to let that fever run its course, because in French politics there's something called the Matignon curse. Matignon is the office of the prime minister, and I can't remember exactly for how long, but in the last sort of 30 or 40 years, no one who has sat in Matignon has gone on to be president. So the idea behind this theory is that Macron would have let them into government that have been bogged down for 3 years, struggling to govern in cohabitation with him, because he would have remained president, but they would have had the assembly, so they'd have governed domestically, he'd have governed abroad. And the French people would have seen that they were incompetent crooks and would have returned to voting for the sensible centre come the presidential election. I personally think the Pedro Sanchez theory was more likely, but there are people close to him who say that he's been flirting with this inoculation idea as well. So it may have been even a mixture of the two, he gambles on Pedro Sanchez, on throwing everyone into disarray, but if the gamble fails and he lets the right in, well, win-win for him, because then he can inoculate the French people against this virus of national populism, fascism, whatever you want to call it. However, Both of these gambles failed because in a stunning turn of events, the French left united in a formation called the New Popular Front, recalling the Popular Front government of the 1930s against the rise of fascism then, and managed in the second round to come out as the largest party. So Macron has suffered a bruising defeat here.
Yeah. So there's on the one hand, the sort of dividedness of the French left was Macron thought that he could use that against the left. They would squabble. But in fact, what happened is that the right almost immediately squabbled. There was quite an extraordinary series of declarations from different parts of the right. So the French right is not one party, right? It's a collection of parties with now a very dominant voice in the party that used to be known as National Front and is now called the National Rally or Rassemblement National. And that's headed by Marine Le Pen. But still, there are sort of factions inside that. Some really extraordinary turns of events in which, for example, some group of people from the Republicans, who is sort of the centre-right-ish party on the French right, got locked out of their own office. Can you just talk through this collection of events? Because this is really quite an extraordinary sort of image to give us flavour of the kind of chaos that I think Macron was hoping to sow both on the right and the left, but only really managed to sow on the right.
Éric Ciotti is the leader of Les Républicains. He ran a campaign to become leader and be the presidential candidate before 2022 as a kind of insurgent. He narrowly lost then because a group of party apparatchiks banded together to elect Valérie Pécresse. She ran this very confused campaign that was trying to combine Macronism with the insurgent Ciottism. It didn't work at all. She didn't even get her deposit back.
With what? Sorry? She was trying to combine it with what?
With Ciotti, the insurgent candidate. His appeal. She failed, didn't even get her deposit back. So Ciotti then, the heir assumptive, took power within the party. Mm-hmm. Ciotti is very, very right-wing. He has called the Great Replacement a priority of national importance. He shares the far-right's views on immigration and crime. He's just more economically neoliberal than them, but very, very similar.
The Great Replacement theory is this conspiracy theory that I think people will probably be familiar with by now, which is that some nebulous entity, sometimes it's the Jews, sometimes it's like international finance in a sort of a displaced anti-Semitism, sometimes it's liberal elites, is deliberately importing non-Europeans, mostly Muslims, into Europe in order to, quote unquote, replace the white majorities of Europe, and in doing so undermine social cohesion and so on. It's obviously nonsense, it's obviously a conspiracy theory, but it's become this sort of lingua franca on the global far right as well. We'll come back to that, but I think that's important to sort of point out what that is then.
Yeah, and it originates from France. So Ciotti called this a priority of national importance, combating this supposed replacement of the white population. Ciotti, because of his proximity to the far right, decided that he was going to end 40 years of the cordon sanitaire, where the centre-right does not work with the far right, and ally himself with the far right, which from his perspective was quite a sensible thing to do because his party has really struggled to find an identity caught between Macronism and Le Penism. And his party has been in a real sort of death spiral since 2017. So it made sense for him to do this. However, some people in his party are still committed to the idea that you keep out the far right from power. So he told everyone in his party he wasn't going to do this, did it, locked himself in his office, while the other members of his party were like banging on the door trying to get let in. He briefed the press out of the window of the office. And you had this completely farcical situation where they were trying to oust him through the courts. He was locked in, saying, no, I'm not going anywhere. I'm still the party president, challenging them. His faction had control of the Twitter. His opponent's faction had control of the Facebook. So they were briefing against each other via the social media channels. A completely sort of ludicrous state of affairs. And then they attempted 3 times, I believe, through the courts to oust Ciotti as party president because they attempted to call no confidence votes. They did not do this according to the party procedure because being a conservative party, it has lots of rules about how you do this kind of thing. And the speed of the election did not allow this to happen. So he remained leader and this alliance was formed. Further to the right, there is Reconquête, which is led by Eric Zemmour. He is this figure that's more or less equivalent to someone like Douglas Murray over here. He was a columnist for the centre-right newspaper, although he has always been on the far right. He wrote a book called The Premier Sexe, which is like a riff on Simone de Beauvoir, very, very sort of misogynist, chauvinist book.
Simone de Beauvoir's book is the Second Sex,
Yes.
which is about feminism and the place of women in society. And obviously, the Premier Sexe just means the first sex.
Yes, yeah.
Man.
He has got into beef with very eminent historians of fascism over the role of anti-Semitism in the Vichy regime in France, though he himself is a Berber Jew from Morocco, and Jean-Marie Le Pen famously said the great thing about Eric is that they can't accuse him of anti-Semitism because he's a Jew. And so he has laundered lots of these really, really right-wing ideas through the press. He then got a job at CNews, which is the far-right news channel similar to Fox, and launched a political party from there. Marion Maréchal Le Pen, sort of a bit complex, there's lots of relationships going on.
That's the niece of Marine Le Pen.
Yeah, the niece of Marine Le Pen, is closer to her grandfather, who Marine Le Pen, that's Jean-Marie Le Pen, neo-Nazi Holocaust denier, who founded the party that Le Pen now heads. Le Pen expelled him as part of softening the party's image, but her niece, Marion Maréchal, has always been closer to her grandfather than Marine Le Pen was to him.
Yeah. So just to go through that sort of one more time, a little bit more sort of in order, I guess. There was a very far-right party. It was called the National Front in France, founded in the 70s by Jean-Marie Le Pen and also by Pierre Bousquet, who was a literal member of the SS.
Yeah.
Like, this is not some sort of like exaggeration. He literally was in the SS. And they found this party. It's extremely far-right, openly so. Marine Le Pen, who is Jean-Marie Le Pen's daughter, attempts from 2011, when she takes over the party, to really sanitize its image, ultimately kicking out her father from it after he repeats a collection of things he said before about the Holocaust being, quote, a detail of history.
Which he did with a gesture of his hand brushing away, I believe.
Yeah. And so she tries to soften the image. She tries to sort of modernize the party. She tries to make the far right in France seem more palatable to people, dissociate it from its Vichy and indeed Nazi past. And then a new generation, partly comprised of Marine Le Pen's niece, but also comprised of this much older person, Eric Zemmour, who is this character you're talking about, has sort of tried to form things to the right of the new position of National Front, or Rassemblement National as it's now called. So like there's kind of a sense of like moderation, and then a new party forms over to the even further right, and that's sort of the dynamic we're getting in France right now.
Yes. But in terms of right-wing chaos, because Zemmour has been an advocate of the union of the right for a long time, and Marion Maréchal is in his party. However, this looks like the perfect moment. This looks like Zemmour's moment. The cordon sanitaire has broken down. However, Zemmour's function in the strategy of the Rassemblement National is that he is an outrider for them, essentially.
Yep.
He makes them look more moderate. Jordan Bardella, the party president of the Rassemblement National, who manages the party's internal affairs and headed its list in the European elections, did not want to ally with Zemmour because he was worried about scaring off wavering voters because Zemmour is more radical. Then this led to this other situation in terms of split on the right, where Marion Maréchal, who, according to some reporting, made up with Le Pen a few months earlier at a family wedding, the whole thing's a family affair, split with Zemmour to join the Union of the Right, brought her back in-house, and took a load of party funds with her. So there was this kind of fracturing on the right as well, although there was also a lot of consolidation. It was a kind of double movement where people moved into the Rassemblement National, but also that fractured the parties to the left and right while remaining on the right of the Rassemblement National. This disunity and the kind of fear of the far right that was generated by this helped the left in the end, because, I mean, we can get into the runoffs and how that all worked in a second, but it meant that the united left was able to, in the second round of different runoffs, come out with more seats than the far right, who were pushed back into third.
Yeah. And just to sort of reiterate this point, I know we've made this already in talking about the founding of the Rassemblement National, the National Front, just how intensely far-right these groups are. A recent poll in which the question is literally, how racist are you? For the parties on the left, you get basically everyone sort of 80% plus saying, not at all racist. Some people saying, oh, maybe a little bit racist. And then very, very, very small numbers of people saying, yes, I'm very racist. I don't know if that's like a guilt thing or people saying, oh, kind of all white people are racist kind of thing. But on the right, we get with the Reconquest, which means reconquest, which is the idea of particularly prominent in Spanish politics, which is basically when Christian Spain retakes the areas that were previously held by Muslims. This is the reconquest. And there's the idea on the right at the moment is this, particularly in Southern Europe, but also in other places as well, like France, is the idea that there needs to be a sort of a new reconquest of Europe by Christian white people. So people voting for or saying they're going to vote for this Reconquest Party, when polled with the question, which is literally, how racist are you? 22% said very racist. Something on the order of about 35 to 40%, it's not actually written down, it's on a bar graph, said, yeah, quite racist. About 25% said, yeah, not very racist. And then the number of people who said not at all racist is about 20%. Right, so we've got a really quite like openly far-right grouping here. And that, I think, is actually quite unusual. People in the UK who will be used to a certain level of self-flagellation about the levels of racism in the UK. In France, we have an openly racist group, right, that is expressing racism very directly in its politics and saying it. How do we get into a situation when France, we're used to, which is a sort of a racist universalist country by its political theory, had a party that was so openly far right? Like, what has happened to produce this situation in the long term since, let's say, the Second World War?
So this has always been part of French politics. Obviously, during the war, there was the Vichy regime, which collaborated with the Nazis, was an intensely anti-Semitic regime and extremely, extremely far-right. Obviously, it was Nazi. And this has been resurfacing. It has always been contentious in France, the degree to which the Vichy regime collaborated with the Nazis. The kind of French national myth is that of the resistance, and this side of the war history has been suppressed, but there has been a long-term effort to rehabilitate it. And this has included people like Macron. Macron said Maréchal Pétain, the leader of the Vichy government, was a great soldier. Eric Zemmour, over the years, has issued huge amounts of apologia for the Vichy regime, including getting into a long-running beef with the historian of fascism, Robert Paxton, about his work documenting the anti-Semitism of the Vichy regime. So this has always been there. And we've seen this in a lot of the RN candidates. Several of them have ties to neo-Nazi groups, including writing for neo-Nazi publications. One of them wore a White Pride Worldwide t-shirt. One of them was pictured wearing an original SS officer's hat in this campaign. So
in this campaign, 2024.
Yeah, 2024. Or rather, those pictures surfaced during this campaign, but it was like last year. It was not. This wasn't a youthful error.
I want to say this is bad politics, right? I want to suggest that obviously, if you want to be elected to office in any country in the world, don't wear an SS officer's hat. That's very clear to me. Is it bad politics?
I think it is for the moment, but that's only for the moment. This politics is becoming more and more legitimate, and we can get into the reasons why in a second. The other thing I think, as well as this kind of Nazi and fascist past retaining a presence in France since the war, in various groups, various groupuscules, underground networks, and then in the Front National, founded by Jean-Marie Le Pen, there is also the imperial crisis following France's the breakup of France's empire, particularly the Algerian Civil War, or the Algerian War of Independence, rather. France has never really got over that. I think we're going to talk about this later, but the Fifth Republic, the current French system, is founded in response to the Algerian War of Independence. And there is a kind of psychosis of French politics about the loss of that colony in particular. And this has produced, for various reasons, an intense Islamophobia in French society. This is not helped by the fact that the state ideology is laïcité, secularism, which is a very worthy aim. However, this, over the last maybe 20 years, has morphed into a way to deny the very existence of racism because it's a universal republic. Everyone is equal. There is liberty, freedom, equality, and brotherhood. So there can't possibly be racism, which is obviously just nonsense. But this has helped this politics of Islamophobia grow. I also think more recently, and this is going purely off vibes as opposed to empiricism, but more recently, I do think the jihadist attacks on France have helped poison the well of political discourse because it's very, very easy to make hay out of them if you're on the far right. Say, look, we've let these people into our country and look at what they're doing to us. Obviously, that's not how things work, and that's stigmatizing an entire population based on the actions of a tiny minority of members of that group, but it's easy politics.
Yeah. So there's this very substantial part of French politics that is right and actually far right, or even, to use sort of slightly different terms, like extreme right, that doesn't really believe in the democratic system. And yet it's never actually attained power in France. And part of that is to do with the voting system. So part of it is to do with this two-stage system in which the first round, people vote for pretty much whoever they want, and also often lodge protest votes, which means that the far right get through to the second round. And then very decisively, the left and the centre, which are both substantial groups of people in France. France is a much more sort of mobilised country politically than the UK is, band together at the last moment to deny the far right the chance at, say, the presidency. This has happened several times. And this is known by different names. So you told me this the other day. This is known by the Republican Front, is one way of understanding it. It's a sort of defense of the Republic against the far right. It's also known as the cordon sanitaire, which is the term used a moment ago, which just means literally like sanitary curtain or something, like the way of like preventing politics of the far right from seeping in. And that's the sort of thing that is at issue when the right-wing party, the Republicans, can't work out if it's going to be in alliance with the far right. But it's also called, and you told me this the other day, the Mitterrand trap.
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting kind of way of phrasing it. And I want to talk through like what is the Mitterrand trap and how the far right has been attempting to leap out of that. And also, who is Mitterrand?
Yeah, okay. So the Republican Front obviously is like the left's conceptualization of this dynamic because they believe in the Republic and they are defending it. And it's the idea of like the society pulling together against this fascist threat. The cordon sanitaire is the begrudging articulation of this idea from the centre-right. Oh, we're going to keep political hygiene. We don't like them. I suppose we've got to do it. The Mitterrand trap is the radical right's articulation of this. It's a trap for them. Mitterrand in 1981 introduced more proportionality into the parliamentary voting system.
And Mitterrand is probably the furthest left president of France since the Second World War.
So Mitterrand is elected in 1981 with the Socialist Party in coalition with the Parti Communiste Français, which back then was much more radical than it is now, on a very, very radical ruptural break from capitalism platform that obviously wasn't carried out in full, or even barely in parts, but elected on this very, very radical program. He, and depending on who you ask, this is because of his youthful support for the far right, or it's because of political convenience, changed the parliamentary system so that it included more proportionality, which for the first time ever allowed the far right into parliament. This meant that the right-wing vote was split and that the right was no longer able to govern as consistently as they had been able to since the war. And it made it much more difficult for right-wing governments to emerge because up to that point, French politics since the war had been dominated by various versions of Gaullism, right, centre-right political formations. There's been a lot of talk recently about how the far right can break out of the Mitterrand trap, and they say that Ciotti has finally done it. Ciotti took the plunge and allied the Les Républicains with the far right, and now the trap has been breached. I think, so from their conceptualization, that probably is true, because now the right is working together. And there were a couple of candidates, I can't remember his name, but there was one who said, I'm a Gaullist, so I will vote for La France Insoumise, because he wanted to keep the far right out.
La France Insoumise is the far left.
The far left, yeah. Against the far right. But lots and lots of people in that party, including the youth wing, which is quite important because that's the future of the party, agreed with the breaking of the trap. This has been called for a long time by certain figures, even on the centre-right. So Zemmour, when he was on the centre-right, has been a long-time advocate of this strategy. And it has moved closer and closer to the centre over the years of the right's war of position, to the point that you can advocate for it in Le Figaro, the centre-right newspaper.
Yeah. So one striking feature of the French system, we've been throwing around a lot of names, but really there's a left-wing bloc that is where the most prominent figure is Mélenchon, Jean-Luc Mélenchon. There's a centre bloc, and maybe people would dispute that characterization, where, of course, the central figure is Emmanuel Macron, the president. And then there's a far-right bloc, where the central figure is still Marine Le Pen. And this is kind of in some ways strange and interesting, because in America, of course, you have a very clear two-party system. In the UK, you have a sort of two and a couple of other kind of extra things party system. In lots of other countries, you get very similar setups. But French politics seems to have, in the last few decades, really, formed into this tripartite thing. So what is your account of how we get into a situation where we have three very distinct entities? And can they really be expressive of what we might think of as, I don't know, Marxists, think of as sort of objective interests, right? Can there really be sort of three different actual interested blocks here? Or do we simply regard it as sort of a strange perversity of, I don't know, the two-round system or something else about French politics?
The point at which to begin this story is 2012. François Hollande, the leader of the Parti Socialiste, very, very centrist figure, is elected a bit like Obama on a platform that he then doesn't carry off. He actually implements gay marriage, which is obviously very good. It seems like hope and change, and then these expectations are frustrated. He does gay marriage, which is obviously very good, but he also implements austerity reforms. This is the height of the beginning of the Eurozone crisis, and he implements something called the El Khomri law, which is a labour law that restricted workers' rights and in particular made it really hard to claim unfair dismissal, which in turn sparked a series of protests called the Nuit debout, which is a bit like the French equivalent of the Indignados or Occupy. A couple of years before this, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, a long-time stalwart of the Parti Socialiste, breaks with the party. He's realised that the left doesn't have a future in this party, and so he forms, for the 2012 presidential election, the Front de Gauche, the left-wing front, in alliance with the French Communist Party. They get about, I can't remember the exact figure, but maybe about 10% of the vote in that election. Over the 5 years of the Hollande's term, people are incredibly disappointed, and a figure starts to gain in prominence from within the Parti Socialiste, a figure you've probably heard of now, I would hazard a guess, Emmanuel Macron. He's brought into the finance ministry from the civil service. He's an intellectual, and he gains prominence within the party, and he starts building a network. In a telling anecdote, he told the journalist Sophie Pedder that he wished the Parti Socialiste had their Clause 4 moment before the election, meaning that he wished they'd abandoned their left-wing promises before the election. He's been on a journey to the right since, but he always had instincts like that. Macron builds this network, and as Hollande is floundering in unpopularity towards the end of his term, Macron kills the possibility of his re-election by starting a campaign which becomes the Parti En Marche. And in 2017, he wins the election by establishing what Bruno Amable and Stefano Palombarini called the bourgeois bloc. He pulls upper middle class voters and middle class voters from the Parti Socialiste on the centre left and from Les Républicains on the centre right, merges them together in this Macronist formation, and that puts him top in the first round of the election, and then the anti-fascist vote brings him into power.
That's the Republican front.
The Republican front, yeah. So what that meant was that the voters of the Parti Socialiste coalition, who weren't willing to join Macron on this journey to the right, flooded out to the left, to Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who has spent 5 years building a political movement called La France Insoumise, which was initially the Front de Gauche, but abandoned the idea of the left in favor of the nation at the advice of the political theorist Chantal Mouffe, theorist of populism. And he does very well with this. In this election, he scores 18%. On the other side, voters of LR who didn't want to join Macron in the centre, they stick with LR for the moment because their candidate, but their candidate François Fillon is very corrupt, and they lose some votes to the RN. 5 years later, they lose lots of votes to the RN. But what's happened since 2017 is the establishment of these three blocs, essentially, led by personalities, what the political sociologist Paulo Gabaldo calls hyperleaders, who connect directly with a base. In terms of the interests that they represent, it's clearer to see this picture now because these blocs have consolidated since then, and you can tell who the electorate is. So on the left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon he represents the interests of racialized workers in the banlieue, downwardly mobile graduates, a bit like the Corbynista base, and what remains of the public sector left through the trade unions. This is Mélenchon's electorate. Macron's electorate, as we've discussed, is the bourgeois bloc. He comes from a background of finance and the civil service, highly educated. His electorate is the upper middle class. You know, it's the France of Emily in Paris. It's those people. And this has become particularly apparent in this election. Marine Le Pen's electorate is now increasingly cross-class. It's radicalized members of the upper middle class who fear the left and have become more radical on issues of race. It is also hugely dominant among les ouvriers. This is the category of manual industrial workers, predominantly in the rural areas and the small towns, what the theorist Christophe Guy calls la France périphérique, the periphery of France. He contrasts the countryside and the cities and says the class war is there, though that excludes the banlieues. And that's why Mélenchon has been able to achieve the heights that he has, because people always forget about the banlieues. And so he has brought them into politics, reactivated them, activated abstentionists, essentially. And that's how this kind of tripartite system has emerged, because people weren't previously trying to activate those people. And Mélenchon has been able to do that, and it has fragmented the system by increasing participation, essentially.
Right. But there's also this other figure who's become very prominent at the far right, who is now the party leader, Jordan Bardella, who himself grew up as part of his mythos. Maybe it's sort of, slightly fake, as these things often are, that he also grew up in a banlieue and then became sort of he's trying to make them a sort of voice on the far right in comparison, in sort of contrast to Mélenchon's.
Yeah. Bardella did grow up in a banlieue to a single mother, but his dad, who did support him, was very rich, and he went to a private school. So, he's trading on his experience growing up in the banlieue, being able to say, I experienced the Great Replacement. I saw the barbarism in the cities. I know what it's like. I grew up poor there. They've taken France from us.
Right.
Actually, he's quite well off. I'm sure he had some difficult experiences in a single-parent household, but he did have paternal support.
Right.
And it's not the rags to riches story that he presents it as. Though he has been in the Front National, Rassemblement National, although some people do insist that you call it the Front National. He's been in the Rassemblement National since he was 16, is a protege of Le Pen. He's a charismatic guy, good-looking guy, wears nice suits. He's, if your nan was to see him, she'd say, oh, what a nice-looking boy.
He's 28.
He's 28,
He's
yes.
28 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very, very, not even intelligent, social media-genic.
Right.
He's big on TikTok. He used to stream Call of Duty on YouTube, got a big online following.
Of course, the real important question here is like, what happens now? Let's just go through what are the results in the Assemblée Nationale. Like, what has happened? What are now the situation on the ground in terms of number of seats that each person has got, each group has got? And then what kind of coalitions might we see forming?
Yeah, so let's take it across the two rounds, because the first round can give you a sort of clear picture of the blocks, because people vote without having to think tactically, and then the second round produces the outcome based on who you hate more. In the first round, the centrists, I believe, got about 23% of the votes. The left got about 29%, and the far right, no, this was revised down by the Interior Ministry. The centrists got 23% of the vote, the left got 28% of the vote, and the far right got 30% of the vote, there or thereabouts. In the second round, which is when the seats are allocated, the far right got pushed back into third. They got 125 seats. The centrists got 152 seats, and the left got 178 seats. So the left out in first, but it's quite close. And the thing about the second round was that in terms of raw vote share, the far right did better. The reason that the vote changes between the second round is because people vote tactically. So immediately the left, including Mélenchon, called for their candidates to stand down if they were third, because this election produced an unprecedented number of triangulars where 3 people made it into the second round. They crossed the threshold and made it into the second round, which is reflective of the 3 blocks, right? The left says, we're going to stand down our candidates where we are third, so that the chance of a candidate from the Republic has the best shot at beating the far right. This puts pressure on Macron and the centrists to do the same. They don't do it in every case. In fact, Edouard Philippe, who leads one of the blocks, one of the parties in the centrist coalition, says, not going to vote, don't give any votes to La France Insoumise. They're not Republicans, they don't like the police, they break windows, they're anti-Semites. Macron and Attal don't say that exactly, but they hint at it, that you should vote for candidates who share the Republican values. They've spent the last few years claiming that LFI don't have Republican values. So while they
LFI is La France Insoumise, it's
yes.
the far left bloc.
Yeah, the far left bloc. So they didn't explicitly say don't vote for La France Insoumise, but they hinted at it. But they did stand down in 80 seats, and some votes did go to La France Insoumise candidates, and a lot more went to New Popular Front candidates in cases where they were in a better place to beat the far right than the centrists. And so because of this tactical voting and the Republican front barely holding, the left came out on top, the right got relegated into third, and the centrists came a surprising second.
But there has to be a coalition, right? From now on, there has to be a coalition, otherwise there'll be a minority government, which will just get no confidence by the rest of the people in the assembly.
Yes. What happens now is not clear. Mélenchon and La France Insoumise, the far left, populist left, would like to govern as a New Popular Front minority, maybe relying on some help from the centrists on certain things. Because in the French parliament, there is a thing called the Article 49.3, where you can overrule the parliament to pass laws. Mélenchon called for rule by decree if necessary. So they want to try and implement as much of their program as they can through a minority government.
And who is it who calls that? That's the
Prime Minister.
So the Prime Minister is, by convention, the largest bloc gets to put the candidate forward for a Prime Minister, and they normally get it, right?
Yeah.
And so that would be a left-wing Prime Minister, but in an overall minority position inside the Parliament.
Yes. There's a lot of complications, and we'll have to get into them over the course of the next couple of minutes, because this is an extremely complicated situation. The left is riven by infighting, although it is a front.
What?
Yeah, I know. Although it is a front, there are actually sort of factions at play. They probably although La France Insoumise is the biggest party, they are still outnumbered by every other party put together, who will probably try and put forward a different candidate for PM than Mélenchon or a Mélenchoniste. That'll probably be someone like François Ruffin. He used to be a Mélenchon's party, has broken with it over lack of internal democracy, over too much populism, too much aggression. But he's probably palatable enough to everyone involved that he could be PM. So if a left prime minister occurs, it will probably be someone like him. However, Gabriel Attal, Macron's prime minister, who attempted to resign but whose resignation was refused by Macron, has tried to open the door to a technical coalition of the centre, which they hope would span the Greens, who are fairly radical, or at least have radical elements, but, they're a Green party. And so they have some sort of softer left, centre left elements as well. They hope that this coalition could span the Greens to the parts of Les Républicains who didn't join the far right, and that a prime minister could be appointed from this coalition. They would probably attempt to make that someone like François Hollande or Jérôme Guedj, people who are in the Parti Socialiste but are on the right of it, people who were the kind of grouping that initially gave Macron and Attal their careers. That's an attempted formation. It's currently not clear what's going to happen. This next week is going to be a week of intense negotiations, a lot of constitutional wrangling. Everyone is going to have to learn a lot more about how the French constitution works, because Macron has always made it his mission to test it to its limits, and he may continue to try and do that. The other thing to think about is the fact that constitutionally he's allowed to dissolve the parliament again in 1 year's time. So whatever happens, this will probably be only a government for 1 year before a second election is called. If Mélenchon's proposal of a left that can rule by decree doesn't work, and there are good reasons to think that it might not, it's looking like France is headed into a period of quite intense instability and institutional gridlock, because the three blocs are roughly the same size.
We are now on the Fifth Republic.
Yeah.
There have obviously been four republics before. We mentioned earlier that sort of crisis of what I don't want to call France's late colonial period, but sort of mid-colonial period, the Algerian War of Independence, the crisis around this, which is really extraordinary, right? What happens is that there is a coup in Algeria, and they have to bring de Gaulle back, the sort of hero of the Free France in the Second World War, to be this sort of candidate of national unity, who then founds the Fifth Republic.
In a coup itself.
Yes, yeah. And so there is this tradition in France of sort of refounding the republic with a new set of constitutional parameters. That's a real thing. It could actually happen. It's not this kind of incredibly technically complicated thing like it would be in, say, America. It's actually been done quite a few times before. Are we looking at a crisis of that kind of magnitude and depth, that we might have a sort of a deep refoundation of how the French state actually functions?
I suspect the crisis is at least approaching that magnitude. A substantial portion of the French population has voted for the left, who are promising a Sixth Republic. The Fifth Republic is generating absolute gridlock, and I don't know if the listeners recall a couple of years ago, but there was a letter from some generals written anonymously which threatened civil war. And because France is a heavily mobilized society, civil war is an overstatement, but there are clashes occurring. There are neo-Nazis trading in woods. There have been mobilizations of the left which have been met by counter-mobilizations of the right. The Fifth Republic is producing an incredibly polarized and divided society, in which parts of the population activate, rebel, and then fall back into place, but without necessarily achieving their goals. In terms of is it a good thing or a tenable thing to have no government? Will it affect the lives of everyday people? I suspect a lot of people will be breathing a sigh of relief in no government, because the Macron government has been exceptionally brutal in a lot of ways. It's been particularly austerian. It has swung to the radical right on certain issues. So they implemented an immigration law, which Le Pen hailed as an ideological victory. And they have militarized the police and meted out police violence with kind of wanton abandon. So in terms of if you're a rural worker, you probably know people on unemployment insurance. You might not find it too bad that the unemployment insurance has now been cancelled. If you're a teacher or in the public sector, all of these shock reforms that are being administered now can't take place if there's no government. So I think a lot of people might actually experience the gridlock as a form of relief in terms of how it impacts their lives, even while the mediatized political sphere is at its most enervated.
So there is this sense of a deep crisis in France, and I want to go through some of the different dimensions of that. You and I went to France in May last year to go and attend the May Day protests. And what we were trying to do in that podcast, which you can listen to in the same feed you're listening to this one, it's called Tout le monde déteste la police, or Everyone Hates the Police. And what we were doing in that podcast was surveying the French left, which at that time was extremely active. This is just over a year ago. There were very key issues, some of which had to be forced through in the manner you were talking about earlier with the thing called 49.3, which is an article of the French constitution that allows rule by decree. So the pension age was lifted, for example. There are lots of struggles around environmentalism. There's the sort of ongoing question of French integration with Europe. There's the increasing saber-rattling that Macron is doing over the war in Ukraine and the idea of a sort of independent European security pact that doesn't rely too much on the Americans. There is this question in New Caledonia as well, which is interesting and nuanced and complicated. Like, there are lots of things going on. Give us a sense of some of the issues that are at stake, or sort of the crises that are at stake in French politics a year ago, and how have they transformed now, and how will they transform again in the future?
To start, I would pick out the cost of living in La France périphérique, in rural France. This sparks the biggest revolt of recent years, the Gilets jaunes, Yellow Vest protests, which start as a revolt against a tax on fuel, because in rural France you need your car. And it morphs into a movement for deepening French democracy. It's completely ideologically muddled. It has far left elements, far right elements, and sort of oddly apolitical populist elements, a bit reminiscent of the Five Star in Italy, which speak in the name of the people, demand a moral economy, but don't have a clear left-right character, influenced by both. That crisis has not gone away. That ideology has not gone away. A lot of people demand the dégagisme, the throwing out of all politicians. They are very, very upset by the cost of living and the price of energy in rural France. That's one aspect of the crisis. That protest movement then revivifies a trade union movement because they successfully got the fuel tax cancelled. They weren't organized via any kind of mediating structures. They were a networked movement organizing on roundabouts, organizing in street protests in the cities, blocking traffic and rioting, essentially, and protesting. And yet they managed to get Macron to cancel one of his signature reforms. They get him to promise some measures for deepening democracy, which obviously he doesn't do properly, but he does it, and he raises the minimum wage. And a trade union movement surfing a long wave of defeat looks at that and goes, oh no, they've done that and they're not even organized. So this helps revivify trade unions. We spoke in that podcast to Jérôme Rodriguez. He was a prominent Yellow Vest figure, and he told us about the Gilets jaunification of the unions, the Yellow Vestization of the unions. The members at the base of the unions became increasingly radical. This obviously also coincides with what we talked about with Mélenchon pulling the left in France away from Hollandism and towards a more radical populist pole. This is also activating stuff at the same time. And the unions become more radical in their demands. There's also the strengthening of fringe unions that are a bit more like the IWGB. We put so Force Ouvrière, Solidaire, SNCF in education, and radical wing of the CGT union, which is the second biggest union in France. This helps pull even the centre-left conciliatory unions into a more radical stance. And so the public sector left and the unionised private sector workers are also out here demanding cost of living measures, employment reforms, and an overturning of the slow neoliberalisation that has occurred in French politics in the last 40 years. Simultaneously, you have a couple of other crises. You have crises relating to race and immigration. So this is experienced differently by different people. Obviously, if you're on the far right or the identitarian right, you experience waves of immigration as a threat to your identity. And this has led to a rise of fascist groupuscules. There have been more neo-Nazi marches in recent years, some quite big ones, in fact. And then obviously also in the banlieues where the racialized populations live, they are experiencing quite intense policing. And over the last few years, there have been Black Lives Matter style outbursts of protest and honestly rioting, which is what we saw last year after the execution of the teenager Nael Merzouk by police. They shot him in the back completely unnecessarily. It was murder. And this led to very, very violent outbursts of rioting, property destruction, people attacking the police, which is not a moral condemnation of those tactics or a condoning of those tactics, but I think that is kind of what happened there. It was quite intense and quite violent. So you have that kind of the crisis of immigration and race in France, which, depending on how you look at it, corresponds to different outbursts. And then you also have an environmental crisis. This has been particularly acute around water because France, especially the south, has experienced quite intense periods of drought. You have big agribusiness constructing these mega basin projects, which are a great example of what Nancy Fraser calls cannibal capitalism, because they drain the water table for the pursuit of agribusiness profits, and then that makes the water table unable to replenish, undermining the conditions of those very profits, right? And this has seen a huge backlash from small farmers in the Confédération Paysanne, the Peasants' Confederation. They're very, very radical, small-holding farmers who engage in sabotage tactics. Also, the birth of a quite radical environmental movement called Le Soulèvement de la Terre. Last year, we spoke to Baptiste, who was on the field at Saint-Soline, where it looked like a war zone. I would encourage listeners to look up Battle of Saint-Soline on YouTube, because there were just thousands of rounds of tear gas fired in defense of this mega basin, people running towards the police, throwing stones and Molotov cocktails and stuff at them. It was a very, very intense conflict. So you have this kind of eruption of environmental protest as well. And then Mélenchon's party is attempting, as part of its strategy, to metabolize these different social movements. They appoint strike leaders as MPs. They've just appointed an Antifa leader as an MP. They've appointed members of environmental movements as MPs. And they've appointed representatives from the banlieues as MPs. They're very close to a woman called Assa Traoré, who is like an equivalent to a Black Lives Matter leader in France. Though I think the French immigrant and banlieue movements are much more sort of focused than Black Lives Matter. They have concrete sets of demands, and they are better at not falling into race reductionism, I would say, than certain BLM tendencies in the US or UK.
And then we've also seen in the last year a crisis in New Caledonia, which is a sort of French colony, basically. What's going on there? How has that played into the election?
Yeah, this is really, really interesting. I didn't know a huge amount about this until recently when I started speaking to members of the independence movement, but it's absolutely fascinating. So New Caledonia is a Pacific island that France inherits, I think, from Britain way back in the height of imperial power, and has ruled as imperial powers do, economic and racial segregation, subordination of the indigenous Kanak population.
It's near Australia.
It's near Australia, yeah.
Right.
In 1945, it is briefly put on the UN list of countries awaiting decolonization. It's then taken off, and it gets put back on in the 80s, because in the 80s, the Kanak population rise up, a sort of civil war called Les Événements occurs. And in the late 80s and 90s, under a left-wing government, a series of peace accords are reached with a decolonization agreement, which included 3 independence referendums. The first of those happened a couple of years ago. The independence movement didn't achieve a majority. It got like 39-40%. The second one of those occurs in 2020, I think. And the independence score goes up and it gets close. And it's looking like that by the third referendum, they will be able to possibly achieve independence. However, you might remember there was a pandemic going on at that time. And in 2021, the indigenous movement attempted to capitalize on their momentum, asked the French state if they could have the next referendum in 2021. The French state agreed. The island was absolutely ravaged by COVID. This meant that the third referendum occurred under conditions that were completely unfavorable, and the French state refused postponement of the referendum. So the indigenous Kanak population and the independence groups boycotted it. So it was 97% pro-remaining part of France. The electoral body in New Caledonia has been frozen for some time as part of the peace accords because part of the imperial strategy originally was importing French settlers to undermine the political power of Kanaks. After the Civil War, they agreed to freeze it, how it was. And Macron has proposed unfreezing this for elections on the island so that French settlers can vote. And there are some good reasons for doing this in the sense that there is a part of the population who are essentially disenfranchised because they've been there a while and they live there, but they can't vote. But obviously this is being interpreted from the Kanak perspective as an attempt to undermine their political power. The reason that the French state is so keen to hold on to this island, you might think, well, if this is such a headache for them, why would they bother holding it? Well, New Caledonia is host to 25% of the world's nickel reserves, which are very, very useful for the production of electric vehicles. And it is also part of Macron's strategy called the Indo-Pacific Axis, where he attempts to project French influence into the Pacific via diplomacy conducted from the island. In recent months, after the passing of the law to unfreeze the electoral body, there have been very, very intense conflicts on the island, scenes that I've been told by people who were there and who know the island's history are genuinely reminiscent of the Civil War in the 80s. The French World Cup winner from 2004, maybe, Christian Carambeau, is from the island. 2 of his family members were executed by white settler militias wielding sniper rifles. People have been killed in the special economic zone. 3 police were killed, I think, during the riots, though one of those was friendly fire because a cop's gun went off. As it was put to me by a member of one of the independence movements, the Kanak youth are in full revolution. They built barricades all across the city of Novara and were like resisting the police, fighting the police, and in some cases getting killed by these militias that had formed. So a very, very deep crisis. The French left came out in favor of decolonization, of continuing the freeze of the electoral body and working towards decolonization. Even the French far right proposed another referendum because I don't think they care that much about the island. They probably don't really consider it France because they're kind of ultra nationalists, and they were fine to have another referendum. Macron has remained incredibly intransigent, as has the minister in charge of this, Sébastien Lecornu, and they are sort of committed to ruling it with an iron fist. There were, can't remember, centaurs. Centaurs are these armored vehicles that the French police have. They shipped a bunch of those over to the island. Macron thought that he could go over there and calm things down, which I don't know why he thought that, because he has not calmed a single situation down in his life. Every time people are angry and he shows up, it makes things worse. And that's unsurprisingly what happened. In the last election, a MP for the FLNKS, the left-wing independence movement, was elected. This is the first time a Kanak representative has sat in the French parliament since the 80s. And he will be, I imagine, quite aggressively advocating for Kanak interests. And so this is another front in the kind of late imperial crisis of the French state.
One other thing to say about that sort of geostrategic aspect of holding on to New Caledonia and projecting power into the Pacific is that there is a new trilateral alliance of great significance here, which is the UK, Australia, and the US, also known as AUKUS, which is a sort of military alliance that's essentially using nuclear-powered submarines to contain China in the Pacific, right? Which is of interest to the three big Anglophone military powers. France is also a serious military power. It's a nuclear power, has nuclear-armed submarines. It was left out of this deal for reasons that are shadowy and opaque. But it has been recently, in the last few years, since particularly the invasion of Ukraine, trying to throw its weight around militarily in Europe. And as I mentioned earlier, trying to establish a sort of a European army, as opposed to simply relying on NATO, which is, of course, overwhelmingly under the command of and under the control of the Americans. Macron has made lots of saber-rattling moves in this regard. What is the left position on this kind of thing, the right position on this kind of thing? And also, interestingly, there is this other dimension of French foreign policy at the moment, which is that France has probably the most amongst all European nations, been most critical of Israel in its pursuit of the war in Gaza. And so I'm curious about this dimension of French foreign policy and how that relates to the political situation domestically.
Yeah, so Macron is a few things at once, but he takes from Gaullism. Gaullism sees France as having a role in the world independent of the US as a power broker, essentially. And that explains some of what Macron does. Macron initially was against NATO. He called it brain dead before he was elected because he viewed NATO then as a vehicle of US imperial power that was subjugating Europe. Now he is pro-NATO because he sees the strengthening of NATO and particularly in regards to Ukraine as a way for Europe to achieve this strategic autonomy that he's always talked about, where it can defend itself independent of the US and doesn't have to go along with the US line. Europe can advocate for its own interests as a continent. The right's position on Ukraine and Russia it's not as pro-Russia as it might have been in the past. There have been long documented monetary and financial links between the Rassemblement National and Russia. There's a very good archive on the investigative site Mediapart of all of the financial ties between Le Pen's party and the Kremlin. However, the line of the Rassemblement National is that they support Ukraine, but they do not want troops on the ground. They call it a war crime, but they are not going to get involved militarily. This, I think, and I'm sort of spitballing here, but I think this is because the far right has learned to stop worrying and love the EU. They've realized that the EU is an institution that can be a vehicle for their kind of interests as ethno-nationalists, Fortress Europe, Frontex, all of this. In fact, the head of Frontex is now a candidate for the RN. And so the Ukraine war offers them they want to defend Europe now more than they would have. It's not just nationalism. They think that they can achieve a kind of pan-ultranationalist alliance. We saw this recently when there was a big conference in Spain. All of the far rights gathered together working out a sort of plan for Europe. The left's position is split. Mélenchon and the Parti Communiste Français position is honestly not that different to the RN's. It's more about peace advocacy, but in terms of practicalities, fairly similar, I suppose. People say that Mélenchon has a soft spot for Putin. I think this is nonsense. But their position essentially is that Russian invasion is a crime. They support Ukraine. However, and I think some of them have even supported arms shipments, though not all, of La France Insoumise. However, they would like France to act as a diplomatic broker. They were supportive of Macron in his initial moves to act as a diplomatic broker, which he's now abandoned, and they criticised Macron for saber-rattling and escalation.
This is in his wearing a hoodie and having stubble period when he was trying to look like Zelensky.
Yes.
It's some incredible photos.
Yes, yeah. Macron is a walking meme. One of the leading figures on the French centre-left is this guy, Raphael Glucksmann. He is extremely pro-Ukraine, is pro-escalation. He's criticised Macron from a position of hawk. He wants more involvement in Ukraine. He wants troops on the ground. He said Macron's words are great, but he needs to match it with action. That's the reason that the New Popular Front's programme included a section about arms shipments and support for Ukraine, because that was a red line for Glucksmann, basically. In terms of Israel, I wouldn't say that France is the most critical of Israel in Europe. The Spanish government is.
Oh, yeah, of course. Sorry. Who recognise Palestine.
Yeah. But I think a couple of things are going on there. The first is Macron's desire to be independent of the US. He, I think, saw an opportunity to take leadership of Europe in criticising the Israeli state, because it was obvious that this was going to happen. And so he acted as a first mover to position himself again as a leader of Europe. Also, France has one of the largest populations of Jews and Muslims in Europe, and the French state is definitely worried about tensions and internal domestic uncertainty. And so they've tried to tread a line between being a critical friend to Israel and being critical of Israel, where they try not to upset either side. That's come from government sources. That's how, in newspapers, that's how they see it. Macron essentially wants France to lead a European bloc independent of the US. That's the guiding kind of motivation behind a lot of his thinking.
A sort of pan-European Gaullism.
Yeah.
There is maybe a sense in which France is entering a sort of ungovernable phase, in which no party has hegemony, but lots of different parts of the political scene are mobilized. This is, I don't want to sort of ring this alarm bell too early, this is not far off the kind of situation that one had in Weimar Germany, right? And that seems like, this kind of ridiculous reductio ad Hitlerum, this sort of endless, just compare everything to Weimar Germany, right? But with a far-right group that, as we mentioned earlier, has something like 70, 80% of its people being like, yes, I'm a racist, right? That's not such a ridiculous comparison. Obviously, France is embedded within a basically liberal European structure and so on, so it's not going to, see another Third World War from, France attacking Germany or whatever. That's not going to happen. But nevertheless, we are in a situation where there is not only the triumph of the left, and I don't want to undermine that or diminish that in these elections, but also a very powerful, very mobilized far right. How far does that comparison get us? Are we in that kind of large-scale crisis right now?
I'm not a historian of Weimar Germany. However, I do think the political crisis in France is incredibly deep. If you talk to people in all sections of French society, there is a sense of frustration and malaise, fear about various different things. If you're in the countryside, it's a sense that democracy has abandoned them. This was common in the Gilets jaunes. Some people feel that that's been the case since 2005 and the referendum of the Lisbon Treaty.
When the French vote was ignored and the Lisbon Treaty was imposed, regardless.
Yeah. As I said, there's the mood of dégagisme in which lots and lots of people believe that all politicians are the same and they demand the throwing out of politicians. There is Serge Alimi in an interview for the New Left Review called The Condition of France, described parts of the French countryside as like Marx's sack of potatoes, disorganized but rebellious. And I suppose that is fertile soil for a far right of some kind, or certainly radical nationalist movements, political entrepreneurs of various stripes. And we've seen that with the hyper leadership of Macron, Mélenchon, and Le Pen. They are all attempting to hegemonize this situation, but are struggling. And I do think that anything that looks like anti-politics is going to fare better in this situation than others. And so maybe the far right can capitalize on that. Also, as I said, there are these tensions around immigration, integration, race. And the far right are very good at fostering an atmosphere of race war, as we've discussed. 74% of the people say that they are at least somewhat racist. And so again, that is, again, fertile soil for them. I think the key thing is this kind of disorganization, basically. Because there have been lots and lots of upsurges among farmers, rural people, unions, environmentalists, immigrants. But aside from some unions, organizations haven't really emerged. And so this energy can be channeled into different ways and into two different ends. With France's media system as it is, currently being hijacked by far-right billionaires, people like Pierre-Edouard Stéhan, people like Vincent Bolloré, I suspect that the far-right are not wrong to be bullish about their future.
Will France beat Spain?
They've not been playing that well since Mbappe broke his nose. I'm going to say Spain.
Great. Well, we will test your predictive powers because the listeners will know already. Thank you very much, Olly Haynes.
Thank you.
Support independent journalism and set up a regular donation to Novara Media from just £1 a month. Head to novara.media/support. Or face the consequences.